Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation, but it is 12:05, and so it is time for us to begin this program. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the Library and Museum here at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to APS's Lunch at the Library, one of our monthly ongoing public programs. We're going to begin this, as we do every public program, with a land acknowledgement. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. I also, because some of you are familiar faces, but not all of you are familiar faces, am going to give you a very, very brief overview of the American Philosophical Society. We were founded in 1743 and are the nation's oldest learned society. I use this quote because it's one of my favorites. In our founding document, the proposal for promoting useful knowledge in the British plantations, Benjamin Franklin, one of our founders, wrote, as the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessities, is now pretty well over. He thought it was time. It always gets a laugh. I do like that. He thought it was time, and his colleagues, to set up a learned society to share useful information, predominantly applied scientific information, to help make life in North America better. We continue that tradition today in a variety of ways. We have, as we did in 1743, an elected membership of just about 1,000 members, most of them in the United States, but a fair number international. We hold 2 large conferences of those members each year, as well as a host of library and museum conferences and dozens of special events and lectures like the one you are participating in today. We also have an active press, the oldest continuous operating press in North America, and we support research offering over 300 grants a year. For those of you who have not been, how many of you have been to the APS library, the reading room? Excellent, excellent. For those of you who have not, we probably have something that would interest you. We have over 14 million pages of manuscripts, 325,000 plus books, the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, and then myriad digital objects, and an increasing amount of born digital material as we're rethinking the way archives work, as well as over 3,300 museum objects, which I will come back to in just a moment. The work of the library and museum is funneled through 4 scholarly academic centers. And to give you a sense of how we support that work, we offer roughly, in addition to those grants, those 300 grants which send people around the world, roughly 50 fellowships here at the archive and library. We also promote and publish scholarship, and we promote public programming. We've had 130 programs that brought in nearly 7,000 participants within the last year. And how do we do it? We do it with help from all of you. Many of you I know are already friends of the APS, but if you're not, please do consider joining us so that we can help to support this work collectively and ensure that it expands and reaches the largest audiences possible. And before I turn to today's program, I would be remiss, now that I have all of your attention, to also encourage you to visit another part of the APS that is open and free to the public, which is our museum, currently hosting the exhibition, Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City. How many of you have been to Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City? Excellent. For those of you who have already been there and who want to continue the conversation, we have catalogs for sale in the back of the room. For those of you who have not been to Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, and you want to get a introduction to what you might be exploring, we have catalogs for sale in the back of the room. And now for today's program. It is my pleasure to introduce Aaron Sullivan, an author and historian living near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with his amazing spouse, 2 inexhaustible children, and 1 very neurotic dog. He serves as professor of history at Rider University in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, and his book, The Disaffected, which was published by Penn Press in 2019, received the Book of the Year award from the American Revolutionary Roundtable of Philadelphia. Sullivan received his doctorate in history from Temple University in 2014. Joining him in the conversation is Carolyn O'Connell, who is the exhibition's curator here at the American Philosophical Society. Her work explores the intersections between design and material culture, with an emphasis on questions of provenance, civics, and public memory. She has held curatorial positions at Cooper Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum, and the Museum of the City of New York, and has contributed to exhibitions and publications at various institutions. She has also previously served as the first vice president of the Metropolitan Chapter of the Victorian Society of America, and is an alum of the Addingham Summer School, holds an MA in Decorative Arts, Design, History, and Material Culture from Bard Graduate Center. Moderating their conversation is Brenna Holland, who received her PhD from Temple University and is currently the Assistant Director of Library and Museum Programs. Please join me in welcoming them to today's stage.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. This is such a pleasure. As Michelle said, I'm Brenna Holland. I work here. I've been here at the APS for almost 7 years. But I was really pleased to put together this conversation today because I consider myself quite lucky to have been at the inception of both the exhibition and Erin's book. As Michelle noted in the introduction, I earned my PhD at Temple alongside Erin. We were in the same cohort together with the same advisor. And so I saw this from its very, very early stages in seminar papers, all the way through to it being a book that we're going to talk about here today. And so when the exhibition started coming together a couple of years ago, and then when Carolyn came on board, we started thinking about all the stuff that needs to be read and understood to put together an exhibition on Philadelphia, the revolutionary city. And I'm going to say that I said many times, there's this one book that you should really read. And this was Erin's book, The Disaffected. And so when we were thinking about programming for this exhibition year, I thought, ooh, it would be quite fun to actually show this conversation live to you all. So thanks for being here. So to get started, I want to give allow you opportunity to have a little bit of background on the book. I'm going to get the clicker for you. So Erin, I'm hoping you can talk with us a little bit about The Disaffected and how it came together, what it's about, the quick background for us on this piece of scholarship.
Absolutely. So the original impetus of this book came from what was at the time just an offhanded comment by David Wallstreicher, our advisor at Temple, who said one day, someday someone will write another book about the British occupation of Philadelphia. And I said to myself, oh, that could be me. And so I dove into it, and it turns out it's just a fascinating moment in history. It's very exciting in Philadelphia in the early American Revolution. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. Philadelphia switches sides so often in those first few years. We go from being the capital of a British colony in America to the de facto capital of the United States, fighting for independence from Britain, to suddenly being the headquarters of the British Army, trying to put down that rebellion, and then 9 months later, back again to the de facto capital of the United States. So it's an exciting moment. And though this book is about a military occupation, it's not a military history. Right? The armies are major players in this story, but the focus is really on the effect they have on the population, on the politics, on society, on the economy, all the individual human stories there, rather than on the army itself. So that's the setting for this book. But what it's really about is disaffection, and that's probably a term worth defining a little better. It's a term used at the time in the 1770s to refer to people's allegiance or lack thereof. And it really refers to people who were not strongly attached to either the patriot cause, the revolutionaries, or to the British, who kind of rejected both of those. There we go. It refers to a lot of other people, some of whom may have been disaffected because they rejected both these causes, some of whom were just very, very apathetic and just did not care about the outcome of this war one way or another. Some who cared very, very much about the questions of the time, but did not see their version in either the revolutionary vision for America or the British version for America. They wanted some third way and couldn't support either side. And a key thing about the term disaffection is that it's entirely negative, right? It's a lack of support for one side or another. Whereas the more familiar terms we have, patriot or loyalist, those are affirmative terms, positive connections with one side. I think even pacifist suggests some sort of positive connection to pacifism. Even neutral, I think, suggests some sort of thought-out commitment to a position of neutrality. Disaffection really tends to get everybody else, all the other people who were there during the revolution. And I argue that those other people made up a significant portion of the population, especially here in Pennsylvania. So that's what the book is about. I think a key question with any book, though, is always, but why does it matter? Why should we care about this? And in the context of the history of the time, I think we should care about it because we still, as a society, tend to see the American Revolution as one of our more purely heroic, least tragic conflicts. And the disaffected complicate that quite a bit. We often acknowledge the existence of neutral parties. There's a very unfortunate quote by John Adams about the American population being a third and a third and a third that gets misquoted all the time. But we tend to acknowledge there were other people there, and then we set them aside and continue our story about the Patriots versus the British. And I wanted to complicate that a little bit more, to show that the existence of the disaffected here was significant, to make us think more deeply about it. And I think it especially makes us think more deeply about questions of popular sovereignty, about what it means for this new government to be government by the will of the people. And the way I tend to explain this, which I think is kind of fun, is let us imagine that we here today are going to create our own new nation, right? We're going to secede from the United States, and by we I mean just us here in this room. And we're going to create a new nation. I think I have a flag. Yes, I have a flag for us. Right, so I'm going to put up a call for independence, and let us imagine that the portion of you who stand up and affirm and support my call for independence is bigger than the portion of you who stand up and oppose me, who say we should stay loyal to the United States. Right, so there we are, and I look at this, and believing in government by consent of the governed, I would say, well, clearly, by the will of the people, this room is and ought to be free and independent. And you would all say, huzzah!
Huzzah!
But what if there was also a portion of this room, and maybe a very large portion, that hadn't stood up at all, either to support our independence or to oppose it? You are busy enjoying your lunch or looking at your phone, or didn't think that we historians with very little political experience would do a great job running a new nation. But whatever the reason, if this is the actual situation, right, that makes it much more awkward for me to declare that our new nation is created by the will of the people. And this is the situation the revolutionaries found themselves in. They were very aware of it, and it had profound effects on what they chose to do. So that's why I think it matters in our story of the past. I think it matters today because it helps us sort of remember that the all-consuming political partisanship that many of us feel isn't necessarily a reality. And I'm speaking very personally here. It's easy for me to feel like the modern United States is divided cleanly into these two warring camps of what the future should be. And because of the stakes, it's sometimes hard for me to imagine that there could be large numbers of people out there who aren't aligned either for or especially against either of those two visions. And yet that is unquestionably the case, right? If we just look at modern politics and presidential elections of the last half century, nearly every time the largest group of the eligible voters don't vote for either major candidate. Right? We have our sort of own disaffected today. And I think looking at the historic disaffected also helps us to recognize that overlooking and denying the existence of these people tends to invite injustice and oppression. Those who claim to represent the will of the people, even those who really believe they represent the will of the people, will always feel a temptation to silence those who speak out in dissent, or to coerce expressions of consent from the people to legitimate the rule. It happened, I think, far more often than we generally recognize during the Revolution. The book is full of those stories, and I think we should be wary of it today. And finally, I wrote this book because I rather liked a number of the historic stories in it, and I came to like a number of the people who were in it, and I'm very happy to share those with you and everyone else.
Thank you so much, Aaron. So Carolyn, you read this book and used a good portion of it to inform parts of the exhibition, Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, that has been up for just over a month, catty corner across the street, as Michelle mentioned. So with this in mind and thinking about these human stories and this maybe more complete story of the revolution here in Philadelphia, can you talk a little bit about your approach to the exhibition and your thoughts on these ideas?
Absolutely. So I'll just give you a little preview for those who haven't been across the street yet, as Brenna said. So welcome to Philadelphia, the revolutionary city. This opened just in April. And I should say this project really truly does predate me, but in very significant and special ways. Its genesis is 5 or 6 years ago, in fact, with a big idea to work towards digitizing an incredible amount of material from local and regional repositories relating to Philadelphia in the era of the Revolution. So this is a project that is spearheaded by the APS, but with close collaboration from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Museum of the American Revolution, and the Kislak and McNeil Centers at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is a living, breathing, growing digital archive of documents that are all in one place and are incredibly accessible and searchable. And so I bring this up because actually this portal is formally launching online this summer, which is really exciting. So that's the sort of roots. And so when I arrived here at the APS a little less than a year ago, I was given this brief, like, okay, we've just done all this digitization work. There are all of these manuscript and printed materials that are now accessible online. Can we come up with a way to turn this into an exhibition? You have about 9 months and 1,200 square feet, so go. So sort of like having a child while living in a major American city and choosing to live in an apartment. Done it, but it's daunting, right? So a lot of material to go through and a lot of things to consider. So I sort of zoomed out and went curatorially sort of back to basics. So what is this really about? Well, it's about people, as Aaron says. It's these stories, and it's about daily life and lived experience through this period that we now know covers extraordinary and revolutionary changes. And I think it's hitting those 2 points that, yes, also life was ongoing. People were enduring, surviving, thriving even, having normal experiences, while also dealing with this tumult and commotion, chaos and violence. So how to manifest that spatially and physically and from a content standpoint? For me, it was really important to punctuate documents with objects, and that gets a little bit to my material culture background. These are just some views of the exhibition, but how to kind of, as Aaron brings up, sort of personalize some of these stories. And sometimes you can do that really powerfully when you have not just a document, but also, say, an object. So it was important for me to kind of demonstrate some of the things I was saying. And I think curatorially, it's always nice when the thesis of an exhibition can actually translate into the spatial and aesthetic organization of it. So how to tell many stories. And so the approach was a little bit of kind of diving in, giving these little windows, little glimpses, a kind of constellation of many stories. And I'll just give you a few previews here. We can get into them more later. So one of my favorite things, too, is creating these juxtapositions between different objects that might initially seem disparate, but actually have some common threads, if you will. Oops, I'm mindful of time, so I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So both of you in your responses are talking about this sort of complex, complicated. We use the term messy a little bit in the exhibition, and when I was going back through Erin's book, you use the phrase a complex hodgepodge of interwoven interests. And so, can you talk a little bit about how you approach this messiness and this complexity of this moment? I mean, I think that Erin's graphics did a really great job of showing the broad concept, but then when you get into the individuals, can you talk about why you approached these stories in this way?
Sure. Do you want to go first?
I feel like messy is an excellent word for history. Complicated is another one. Often when my middle school daughter comes home and wants to ask me some question about something she learned about history, I always begin with, well, it's complicated. I was at a panel not totally unlike this with Travis Glasson once, and he used the word human, which I thought was very clever, because humans, both now and then, were very complicated. We are varied and multifaceted and irrational and hopelessly inconsistent. And the past is that way too. And we as historians, I think, are always trying, out of necessity and the best possible intentions, to fit history into boxes or to come up with rules that will govern how it works. Because if we don't, then our histories are just this group of unconnected anecdotes strung together. But in doing so, we're always sort of fighting against the messiness and the humanity of history. And I think we try to combat that by interweaving the big boxes and the big rules that are governing what's happening with society with these little bits of stories, these very particular human anecdotes that illustrate something or that sometimes contradict the bigger story about what's going on. They're some of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And I like humanize too, because people are strange. You know, we're contradictory, we're complicated. Just as you say, this isn't new. And for me, from an exhibition standpoint, I wanted to figure out ways to show that. So not just tell people, but to show it. And one of the things I did was to try to lean on just the sheer size and diversity of Philadelphia at that time. The fact that it was the largest city in British North America. It was filled with immigrants, different communities, different languages, complicated economic scenarios, inequities, all these things we sort of know, but it's sometimes hard to see that when looking back into some of these documents. So I did my best to sort of lean on that as a sort of, again, a sort of tack to show just that there could, there would, of course, have been great diversity of opinion because there's great diversity of people living very different types of lives all in one place.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about some of those people and some of the overlaps in your two projects. I know that Erin, you had the chance to visit the exhibition a couple weeks ago and walk through. And so we were thinking about some of these places where there's really significant overlap and some of these personal stories. And the one that most immediately jumps out, to me at least, and I hope to you as well, are the drinkers. And Elizabeth Sandwich Drinker in particular. You know, Erin, in your book, you say she's like one of the most important people. And she's a common name to us, but maybe not a common name to most Philadelphians today. So can you talk a little bit about the drinkers and why they're so important and how they illuminate this moment for you both?
The drinkers are excellent. Elizabeth Drinker has a diary from the Revolution, which is wonderful. It's a gold mine, and many historians come to it. But the drinkers are this merchant family living in Philadelphia during the Revolution. They're fairly well-to-do. They have a big family, and they're Quakers, they're pacifists, and things do not go well for them in the middle of the Revolution. Henry Drinker famously gets arrested and exiled down to Virginia. And they play a major role in my story because they're such a great example of people who were no threat to the Revolution whatsoever. Again, they're pacifists. And yet are persecuted because they didn't sufficiently express support for the revolution that was going on. So Henry Drinker gets banished in part because he will not swear an oath of allegiance to Pennsylvania as an independent state. They will be repeatedly fined throughout the Revolution because Henry Drinker will not participate in the armed militia. There's a moment after the Battle of Yorktown where all the windows and the glass at the front of their house gets destroyed by mobs. Not because they've done anything especially objectionable or loyalist, but they're not appropriately celebrating victory at Yorktown, so they get all their windows broken. So there's this story of this family which really suffers, this harmless family, which suffers because they're not sufficiently revolutionary for the taste of people around them. And Elizabeth is just a wonderful person. She has high adventure. I mean, she gets robbed, stuff gets confiscated from her by armies from both sides. She has an incident where the soldier's walking around her house, drunk soldier walking around her house, waving a sword and swearing, and she's hiding with her children in the parlor. She's forced to take on a British officer during the occupation. She really, really doesn't want to, but she has to. And then it's like they become really good friends, and they're writing letters to each other afterwards, and it's a fantastic story. If you want to read a diary from the Revolution, consider Elizabeth Drinker.
Yeah, second that. Actually, this is the spread we're showing of one of her diaries. There are many that's in the exhibition, and it's actually the pages where she's detailing the lead up to the arrest that will lead to Henry's exile to Virginia. And the language here it's heart-wrenching. I mean, she's a vivid and prodigious diarist, but incredible emotional depth to these stories. And again, she comments on, just as you've captured, both the extraordinary, but also the mundane. She's also a parent of young children. She's dealing with turmoil. She's trying to remain committed to her community and her religious beliefs. And she doesn't want to worry her husband while in exile. So these great passages where she's basically electing not to tell him everything because she knows it will traumatize him further. So she's a fascinating character and a really interesting narrator of this period.
So she, in some ways, I think that's really interesting that she embraces silence as well here, and is a really great example in that way of the disaffection, Erin, that you were talking about, and sort of strategic choices in what she's sharing and how she's responding to these events around her. So Erin, another thing that you mentioned in this last response too was the refusal of Henry Drinker to take a loyalty oath. And this is another piece that is quite similar. There's some significant overlaps between the exhibition and the book, is this concept of loyalty oaths. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means in this moment? Like, who's taking loyalty oaths, why, and maybe in what form?
Yeah, I mean, this is something from the 18th century. It was not uncommon for there to be a requirement to swear loyalty to the king or to the nation. The revolutionaries, however, really embraced this with vigor in Pennsylvania, which is interesting, given that the whole revolution is sort of based on breaking your oaths to the king, and they want you to swear allegiance to a nation which has only just barely come into existence. But they really, really did. And at first, they would use oaths of allegiance to kind of guarantee that only people who are really committed to the cause, true believers, could have a hand in shaping their new government, be that in voting or holding office or in defining how the new state constitution would work. You'd have to swear these oaths to take part. And then a little later on, they would use oaths to really force people to express consent and support for the nation. And they would target the disaffected people who really just wanted to be left alone. Would be forced to swear this oath. There's a moment in 1777, the Test Act is passed, and it's sort of the key piece of legislation here. And it would mandate that you would have to swear an oath renouncing allegiance to King George III and swearing your allegiance to Pennsylvania as an independent state, and swearing that you would inform the government against anyone who might possibly threaten the independence of that state. And if you didn't take the oath, not only could you not vote or hold office, you would also lose the right to bear arms, you'd lose the right to take part in jury trials, you'd lose the right to use the courts to sue people. So if you were defrauded or robbed, you couldn't go to court and use the courts to get justice. You'd lose the right to transfer real estate from one person to another, and ultimately, as Henry Drinker found out, if you persisted in refusing to take this oath, they could imprison or banish you from the state. So the revolutionaries used this oath in a sort of extreme fashion And I would say a lot of that extremity comes out of their commitment, ironically, it comes out of their commitment to representative government. If you really believe that your brand new nation is only legitimated, only justified because it represents the will and consent of the people, well, then you really need those people to express some will and consent for what you're doing, or it sort of cuts out your whole argument for legitimacy. And so they were driven, sometimes subconsciously, I think, to really push people to express support for what they were doing, and oaths were a key way of doing that.
Yeah, so if, and then they show up in the exhibition, so there's a forum. So if we were the independent states of the American Philosophical Society right now, Carolyn, what kind of physical objects would we be asking our audience to use to express that?
Remarkably, and this is where, again, I think materiality can be so helpful when we talk about these moments in history. We're talking about a very, very small pre-printed form that you'd then sign, and there's one right there from our collection. So you just fill in the blanks. But, and this had to be done in front of a justice of the peace, is that right? Yeah, so there's this incredible power in these very tiny little documents, and they're being wielded, as you say, like a cudgel, with increasing levels of coercion, threat of force, or somewhere in between during this period, which I think, as you really nicely elucidate, of great insecurity, really, for this nascent government trying very much to prove its legitimacy. So again, kind of how to humanize this story and how to kind of make it make sense within the fabric of Philadelphia. This is one of a couple moments in the exhibition where we address this. On the left is a letter. It's father to son, Edward Shippen to Joseph Shippen. This is a Quaker, fairly prominent Quaker family. And he's writing to his son in May of '78. So the British occupation is still ongoing at this point, but it's ending imminently, within weeks. And he's writing to his son saying, look, I've considered it all again, and I really think, I think you should go ahead and take the oath. I'm going to take the oath. And a few weeks later, we have the oath. Joseph takes his father's advice, and we have the signed oath. So again, these kind of moments, and these are really nicely framed together, where you can really understand this linearity and these close familial relationships too, and the ways that people are talking about this. I mean, it's fascinating just how candid they are with each other too about this. Like, look, it's been weighing on me, but I'm going to do it, and I think you ought to as well. And so there are a couple instances. We also have another letter between friends in the exhibition, between retiring General John Armstrong, who's actually writing also in the spring of '78 from Valley Forge to his dear friend, lifelong friend really, Benjamin Chew, who is essentially in self-imposed exile in New Jersey because he doesn't want to take the oath in Pennsylvania. And John Armstrong is, in the most affecting language possible, beseeching his friend to just, darn it, take the oath. Stop this. Stop this. They're just going to keep coming at you. So again, just kind of humanizing some of these moments that you can tell these decisions were really agonizing for people.
So these little pieces of paper, like you have in the exhibit, the idea that, I don't know how much was ever actually carried out, but the idea behind this was that you would take this oath and you would get your paper, and you were supposed to carry that with you if you traveled any significant distance in Pennsylvania. So if you were stopped along the way, you'd be able to pull that out and say, no, I'm a good consenting citizen of the Republic. If you couldn't, you might be arrested. So when you see that, you can imagine you were supposed to have that with you if you traveled very far from home.
So these moments that we're talking about are sort of near this end of the British occupation, and there's another moment that's quite near the end of the British occupation that is another favorite and visually interesting moment in the exhibition, and that's this party. The Meschianza, and so it's sometimes it's a little bit entertaining, right? So we can go from these very severe moments of exile and violence and coercion to something quite different and really quite strange, actually. So I'm hoping you can each talk really briefly about this moment of the Meschianza here in spring '78.
Sure. Shall I start?
You've got some great images there, yeah.
You can correct me if I'm... So the Meschianza was something I had absolutely never, ever heard even a peep of until I arrived in Philadelphia. It's sort of a made-up word. It's Ital-French-English. It is a confectionery of a party that was sort of the brainchild of Major John Andre, who many of us know from his more tragic ending because of his relationship with Benedict Arnold and the unraveling of that affair. But he was a thespian in the truest sense, big proponent of theater both in London and actually in British-occupied New York and Philadelphia, if I'm understanding that correctly. And it was organized as basically the party to end all parties, a kind of blowout bash. I think it was over 24 hours long. Yeah. Technically under the auspices of a farewell to the departing Howe brothers. So this would be General William Howe, who's commanding general here in Philadelphia, and his brother Richard, who's
Richard.
Admiral of the Navy. And so both are heading back to England. And again, this is this very strange time in Philadelphia because this is May of '78. The occupation, the British already know, at least at the senior levels, that the occupation is going to end abruptly in a few weeks' time. They decide to throw this blowout bash. And it sort of unites more prominent loyalist civilians with military elite in this fascinating display of opulence, grandeur, and sort of like play empire. So there's a lot of costumes, fake jousting. It's a real blowout bash. And it almost immediately is met with backlash, both back in England, because they're like, wait a second, aren't you guys leaving? So that's critiqued pretty widely over there. And then also here, I mean, it's just ammunition for the returning Continental Congress and patriots to say, can you believe this decadence? Like, how could they? There are people here starving, and they're over here having a giant meschianza. So it's widely panned, but it's sort of fascinating local lore because you hear about these, there are little bits of material evidence of this party. It was real, it was documented, and I'm showing you kind of a little vignette of how we showed a few of these documentary pieces that exist. These are from a library company, and this one in the center there is really wonderful. Those are fabric samples that were supposedly, we have to believe John Fanning Watson, great analyst of Philadelphia, collected when he was putting together his extra illustrated annals in the 1820s, collected from widows and those still living who had participated directly in the meschianza, and they literally cut out little samples of their dresses and adornments and gave them to him to document this occasion. Do you have it?
I mean, that's all great. I think of it as this would be a moment I would love to go back in time and see. Just how amazing would this be? Yeah, so there are British officers dressed as knights in armor, jousting, literally jousting with each other. And big ice sculptures, there's a regatta, there's fireworks. Certainly the biggest party the Americas had ever seen at that point compared to some of the parties at Versailles. It really was absurd. And I think there must have been these great moments for these loyalists, especially these loyalist young women who the British officers had been courting all this time, and they're invited to this party. And on the one hand, you can feel the tension of the occupation is ending, right? You guys are going to leave. What's going to happen to us if we sign on not only as your dates to this giant party, but to this huge, ridiculous, opulent, pro-British thing? But on the other hand, you will never get this chance again. Never again will you be invited to a party like this, to sit beside peers of the realm as they toast your beauty and knights ride by. The tension there inside these young women and for their family must have just been fascinating.
Yeah, so I think that shows in pretty interesting stark contrast the different types of choices, and in a really serious way, the different types of choices that are being made by women and men in this moment. So the choice to take an oath of loyalty, but also the choice to attend events, the choice of what to buy, the choice of where to perhaps travel. These are all really, really fraught moments for people here in revolutionary Philadelphia. So those were a bunch of points of overlap, but there's also some interesting divergences between what, Aaron, you cover in the book and what we were able to feature in the exhibition. And two kind of jump out to me, and I'll let you sort of go with whatever feels right. But Aaron, you talked about in your intro that this book is not a military history, but the militia does play a pretty significant role in how you're able to tell this story. The exhibition is pretty similar in that way, but it's covered somewhat differently. There's a section on bearing arms, but we don't talk that much about the militia per se. And then the second, I think, significant point of divergence is something you've talked a little bit about, but this concept of the problems of freedom of expression or freedom of speech that is a really critical point in the book or argument in the book of this sort of tamping down of this ideal that we hold up as one of the goals perhaps of the American Revolution that in reality is not practiced on the ground is a really critical claim in the book, but is not something that we were able to delve into too deeply in the exhibition. So you want to talk about those choices and those differences?
Sure. I mean, I think what unites them is absence or silence. In the book, the key thing about the militia is the fact that it more or less withers away and vanishes during the British occupation. Washington's papers are really nice about this because he starts off very happy to be given command of the Pennsylvania militia to defend the Capitol, and he very quickly gets annoyed that there aren't very many of them. By Brandywine, I think there's around 1,200 in the field, and then it very quickly dwindles to the single-digit hundreds, and really hits its nadir in February 1778, when the Pennsylvania militia around Philadelphia is made up of about 60 guys in a tavern about 17 miles away from the British. You know, they're hiding and presumably drinking. It's a low moment. And ironically, at about that moment, Congress authorizes Washington to raise a force of 5,000 more militiamen. And there's this wonderful letter where he writes back and says, "Thanks, guys, I'm honored and all, but I don't think it's going to work out the way you think it will." So in the book, the absence of the militia, the withering away of the militia, becomes a sort of a barometer for how do people really feel about this revolution, when it matters, when there's an enemy in the field, when they cannot actually fine you because they've lost control of most of the state. How many people are actually going to turn out? And the answer in 1777 and early 1778 was not very many. And then when it comes to speech and in the press, again, the story is what isn't there, the degree to which dissenting speech was curtailed. The Constitution of Pennsylvania, the new state constitution, did guarantee freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It's right in there in the Declaration of Rights. But they almost immediately passed laws to contradict that. Justices of the peace could fine you if you said anything too inimical to the cause, and the justices of the peace got to pick what the fine was. Two justices together could imprison you for the duration of the war if they really didn't like what you said. And no jury trials, just justices of the peace here. And kind of the height of that silencing came, again, in 1777 from the Council of Safety. And I wrote down a quote because I wanted to get it right. Who had the power to arrest, imprison, and summarily execute, if they chose to, anyone who, quote, from their general conduct or conversation may be deemed inimical to the common cause of liberty and the United States of North America, which is very severe. But so you can imagine this tended to tamp down dissenting speech. So again, the key thing there is silence and absence, which I can only imagine is very difficult to show in an exhibition.
As you might imagine, difficult to show. No, so I did look at, and I love broadsides as much as the next person, but I was really trying to limit myself and make sure we had a diversity of material, you know, personal correspondence, broadsides, newspapers, pre-printed forms, that sort of thing, to really bring out the richness of this period and of this world, really. But no, freedom of speech isn't addressed quite as explicitly as I wish it was, or there was a good way to do that. I do think, again, kind of going back to what I had mentioned earlier, just by kind of peppering throughout with these stories that are really divergent and that suggest really differing viewpoints. And I, too, really tried to avoid labels of loyalist or patriot. I sometimes use those terms, but I largely avoided them. Even things like radical, which I think mean very different things now. And I was concerned about the word count it would take to contextualize it for people. When you only have 40 to 50 words per object, there's a real threat that you won't quite get there. So no, that's something I wish we could have teased out a little bit more. And in terms of militia, I mean, there is a bearing arms section within the exhibition, and that's meant to sort of tease out lived experience about people who actually would have been serving in the militia or the Continental Army, or really the British Army for that example. We have some things related to Hessians also. But the way I think we get at some of the same thematic overlaps is also through ongoing discussions of economics, which ended up being, I knew it would be important, but it's actually a huge through line of the exhibition. Thinking about scarcity, I was adamant about, as Brenna knows, a currency section, to just really tease out the chaos, price control regulations, all of these things. So they all kind of eventually feed in and are very related to the situation with low turnout and the PA militia, and anger and frustration after the occupation too, but they're not quite as directly addressed. Actually, Aaron and I, when we were walking through the exhibition, I was joking to him. I was like, I don't have footnotes. There are no footnotes. I can't do it. Can't do it. I can only do it with a label. So if I can't get it in there, I have to cut something.
Well, so I want to be mindful that we allow some time to have conversation with the audience as well. But on that note, we all have to make choices in our work, and not everything makes the cut. So is there anything that either of you learned about this moment in Philadelphia in the 1770s that you just loved, but you had to leave out of the project?
Where to begin?
There should be so much more.
There's so much more. I was just in our rare book vault the other day with one of my lovely colleagues, and we were looking for something together, and I just froze in front of a row. And they were like, Caroline, let's come on around the corner here. And I was like, I didn't know about this row. And they said, well, Caroline, you didn't go through the entire library to put together this exhibition. I was like, yeah, but I would have picked one of these things and put it. So you have to let go. There are many things I would have loved to include. One thing that I think about often is actually something not in our collection. It's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It's a letter book. It's Grace Groden Galloway's letter book. And it is fascinating and deeply affecting. It is in extremely fragile condition. They don't even really want you to touch it, which is fair enough. And I knew we probably couldn't make that ask. And even if we could, I wasn't sure I could do it physical justice in the space. And even if I did, you wouldn't be able to read it. And that's a challenge I have too. So I don't just want to show something to say I've covered it, from a content, sort of ticking my, historian curator boxes. I want to make sure the object can speak, that I can really do it justice. And if I can't quite justify it, I sometimes have to make those choices. So that stands out in particular.
Well, now I know there's an object by Grace Galloway, which I wish I had had to put in the book. But walking through the exhibit too, you've got the speech by White Eyes there, which I hadn't seen before. And really the whole topic of Native American interaction in Pennsylvania during the Revolution is hardly touched on here. I would have written more about that.
That was hard.
Just after finishing most of the writing for this, I feel like culture really became interested in espionage during the Revolution. There were TV shows about Washington spies and all of this stuff, which is touched on very lightly. I think if I had written this 3 years later, there would have been much more about that. There's all sorts of good stories there that we could have worked on. Prisoners of war, more of the perspective of the poor with their own voice instead of people looking at them. There's so many things I would change about this if I had infinite time and resources.
Well, I think that there's a lot to read and to see. And we'd love to hear from the audience about what else you'd like to learn about this moment of Philadelphia and the British occupation. So we have a mic walking around.
Thank you. Thank you. Did other colonies/states have similar practices to try to enforce loyalty other than Pennsylvania?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's complicated. Because all the states are different. They have their own regimes here. And they all experience very different revolutions, effectively. Pennsylvania has this occupation sort of in the middle of its story, but it's very brief, like one way and then back the other again. New York, on the other hand, has this very extended occupation throughout the entire war. The South has a British occupation, and in Georgia, they're setting up, a civilian government again. So sort of the needs of the revolution at different times and in different places led to different mandates. And I don't know as much about any state as I do about Pennsylvania. But I think because the revolution felt very fragile here, Pennsylvania was always this sort of fractured society. It's hard to get people in Pennsylvania together to do anything. The revolution felt very fragile, and there was this pushing need to prove that, no, we really do represent all these fractured people. And so I think there is some greater extremity to many of those measures here than you see in some other states.
The thing about the drinkers, the couple that's intrigued me for the most, it doesn't happen in Philadelphia and it doesn't happen in Virginia. It happens when they meet. And my recollection is that that's in interior Pennsylvania somewhere. Elizabeth Drinker takes a carriage to meet her husband. And so their trip back can't be documented by definition if they're in a carriage, et cetera. But that hour or 2 hours or 3 hours it gets back to Philadelphia would be really definitional of how the relationship had been changed, maybe. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, I don't know anything about it, but except that I would love to have been in that carriage quietly, because they are such a great couple. The real affection they have for one another, and the way sometimes that's very open and sometimes it's very proper, is interesting. The letters that they write back and forth to each other during the exile are, or at least used to be, in Haverford College.
Yeah.
And they're just wonderful the way they express their feelings for each other or try to emphasize how calm and peaceful they are. And I think you mentioned the difference between what she says in those letters and what is happening in her diary. And you read about cannonballs smashing through houses in the diary, and then she wrote a letter the next day, and not a word. Not going to tell her husband about any of that. But yeah, they're such a wonderful couple.
And Elizabeth, too, is a real advocate for not just her husband, but for her community. I mean, she's part of this small delegation of women that travel to see and dine with George and Martha Washington to plead their case personally. And it just so happens that I think the timing's off, right? It turns out that they're already going to be released, but they don't know that. So there they are pleading this case. So she's really an incredible advocate, too.
I've seen the exhibit, and it's brilliant curation.
Thank you.
Absolutely fabulous. And if any of you haven't seen it, please go see it. It occurs to me that in England, to this day, the Brits talk about our revolution as the Third English Civil War, okay, which is an interesting perspective because the civil rights issues, freedom of speech, the sorts of stuff, things you've been discussing, are often abrogated in a time of war. So we're in a society in conflict here. Different sides are being taken. For example, the show has the British loyalty oaths because when General Howe occupies Philadelphia, he's requiring loyalty oaths.
Yep.
So that's sort of the other side of the coin here.
Yep.
And if you're having to swear for your safety in Philadelphia, you have to swear an oath to George III.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the American revolutionaries are pushing you to sign the loyalty oaths that have been discussed earlier on this panel. That seems to me to have been a dramatic conflict. Was there pushback against the British loyalty oaths in a similar way to the pushback against the reluctance of the Quakers, for example, to swear loyalty to America? Did they do the same for the loyalty oaths demanded by the British?
That's a great question. I think you've got the document from Howe in the exhibit where
one of the broadsides,
So when Howe first invades, he makes this proclamation where he basically just says, all I want you to do is go home. Put down your guns, go home, and we're good.
Very conciliatory.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then by the time we get to the document of the exhibit, he's like, says, I've changed my mind. I've thought about it, and I really need you to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. So the British do have this competing oath, and you can see the disaffected there of, oh gosh, I'm trapped by both sides. One of the interesting things about the British, though, is that they really don't care as much. In fact, not that many people bother to take the oath, even in the occupied city. And it seemed to me the British really only pushed the issue on select individuals, people who they felt like were trouble or were leaders, or especially soldiers who had defected from the Continental Army and come into the city. They would be presented with this oath. But most of the time, the British didn't bother to keep track. And I think that's in large part because they don't need your consent. Their government, they feel, is perfectly legitimate, regardless of how the people of Pennsylvania feel about it at this particular moment. They have tradition behind them. They have a king. They have parliament. They have all of this authority. They don't need consent the same way that the revolutionaries do. So they had an oath, but I think they cared about it much less.
Yeah, that's my sense. But there's an incredible irony there, which you point out. Yeah, so imagine if you're a Philadelphian who chooses not to flee because of the looming occupation. You are somewhere in that liminal space of disaffected and or neutral and or apathetic. And now you're being told to basically sign an oath that is the diametric opposite of what you were just told, and being threatened while doing it. It's an extraordinary situation.
Well, I think that the stories contained here are really extraordinary. And so with that, I think I'm going to recommend that everyone go ahead and see the exhibition or read Erin's book, which is also for sale in the back, or both. Again, there are 3 options here. There is a messiness of choices that you can make. And I'd like to thank Carolyn and Erin for joining us here today. And thank you all for coming.